Hello and welcome to the One Life Church devotional series where we cover the entire Bible in 20 months. Well, we start a new book today, that of Ruth. In addition to that, we continue our series through the Gospel of Mark. Now, Ruth was written, we think, by Samuel, probably in the time of David. And he was looking back into the season when the judges ruled Israel. This particular time, there was a governmental chaos normally, and a huge famine in the land. So I am in this arid wasteland. I'm on the road between Johannesburg and Klerksdorp. I'm doing some ministry up here this weekend. And look at this land here. No sign of rain. No sign of grass. No sign of economic prosperity. Just a deserted wasteland. And that's something like what Elimelech would have been facing. Now, he's an interesting fellow in that he named his sons Canaanite names. So we have an inclination that he wasn't really a very devout man. So he packs his wife, Naomi, and they go off to Moab. Now, that was also huge because the Moabites were despised by the Israelites. They were descendants from Lot. Remember, Lot had an incestual relationship with his daughters, and the Moabites were the result. And so if you married a Moabite, your kids couldn't go into the temple. It was a big deal. So anyway, Elimelech goes trying to run from poverty, and he found it. Trying to run from sickness, and he found it. Trying to run from death, and he found it. So what happens is he dies. And his wife, his widow, has to raise these boys, and they take for themselves Moabite wives. They live for a number of years, and then the boys die. And so this is a charming story of two women, like a cross-cultural friendship develops. And, Naomi says to her daughters, listen, I've heard God is feeding my people back in Judah, so I'm going back. So the daughters say, we're coming. Then she stops them. She says, stop. You need to find yourself new husbands. You need to go back. And because, in those days, for a woman to survive on her own was a pretty tough deal, very patriarchal society. So the one daughter says, okay, Orpah, she says to her mom, bye, okay, I'm out of here, kisses her and says cheers. But Ruth says, no ways. And she says these most famous words in this first chapter, where you go, I will go. She had like this covenantal commitment to her mom. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. And now that word, your God, she must have had some sort of a revelation of God, because that is a very intimate name for God. It's not God Almighty. It's my Lord. Your Lord will be my Lord. So obviously Naomi's faith rubbed off on this Moabite girl. And where you die, I will die. And where you buried, I will be buried. And so she couldn't be swayed. And so she went with her mom, and Samuel describes the story of they go back into Israel. They say, could this be Naomi? Listen, they were in dire straits because they had no land that had been sold off. They had no husband. Naomi was too old to be remarried, really, certainly too old, and her children were dead. And so they were very vulnerable coming into Judah. And the people say, could this be Naomi? She said, don't call me Naomi, because that's a sweet name. Call me Mara, which is a bitter name. And so they come into Israel, and these two desperate women on this journey, a cross-cultural relationship. And it sets the tone for this most amazing story that we'll pick up tomorrow. And so what can we take out of the story so far? Well, this covenantal commitment that they have for each other, this dependence on God that they have, we're going to see is what paves the way for their future. Well, now let's go to the book of Mark. Mark chapter 7. We've been going through this gospel. And we start with the Pharisees nailing Jesus' disciples again for not obeying the customs of the elders. And Jesus says, the prophets were right about you. You hang on to the traditions of the elders, but forgo the laws of God. And he brings up this issue of Corban. We looked at it when we looked at one of the other Gospels, the Gospel of Matthew. He says, you're supposed to be honoring your parents, but you found a legalistic way through the law to ditch your mom and dad and to keep the money for yourself. She said, that's you are ungodly pretending to be godly. And he says to them, listen, what makes a man holy is not what goes into him, not the way he cleans his hands, but what comes out of him that counts. And so that's a real challenge to us. We've got to audit our lives. What do we speak? What do we think? What comes out? Because that's a bit of an indicator of what's on in our heart. And then we see this gospel, chapter 7, ends with him casting out 2 demons. The one is over a girl who's traumatized, and this again is a non-believing woman coming to him and says, she's a Canaanite woman actually, and says, please help me. He says, look, I'm coming to give bread to the children, not to the dogs. And you think, well, gee, that's quite derogatory, but that's describing his mission to the children of Israel. And she says, listen, even the dogs have the crumbs. So she recognizes, look, I might be a pagan, but I recognize your lordship. And he says, because of that answer, I'm going to set your daughter free. And then he sets a deaf and dumb spirit man free from a deaf and dumb spirit. And so we see the authority of Jesus as we close out this chapter. Anyway, I trust that as you read this chapter, that God ministers to you.